In 1965, Frank Herbert published Dune, a science fiction epic centered on one thing: spice. In Herbert's universe, spice was the most valuable substance in existence. It enabled space travel, extended life, and granted visions of the future. Whoever controlled the spice controlled everything. Herbert didn't invent this concept from thin air. He borrowed it directly from real history. For thousands of years, spices were more valuable than gold, more important than oil, and worth more than human lives. This is the true story of how cinnamon, pepper, and cloves reshaped our world. 3,500 years ago, on small islands near modern Indonesia, ordinary farmers and traders did something extraordinary. They climbed onto wooden catamarans, vessels that were little more than two logs lashed together with a sail, and crossed vast stretches of open ocean. These were the Maluku Islands, better known as the Spice Islands. Here grew cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other aromatics that would change history. These brave sailors didn't command great fleets or represent mighty empires. They were just people who realized that what grew naturally on their islands was worth something to the world beyond. So they sailed, and sailed, and sailed. Their trade routes eventually stretched from the Philippines to Madagascar, covering thousands of miles of open water on vessels that shouldn't have survived the journey. But they did survive, and they brought spices to the ancient world. By the 1st century of the Common Era, India had become the great marketplace where East met West. Indian merchants traded local black pepper and turmeric for island spices. Prices were astronomical. In ancient Rome, the empire spent the equivalent of $185 million annually just on spices. When the mad Emperor Nero buried his wife, he burned an entire year's supply of cinnamon on her funeral pyre. People didn't just cook with spices. They used them as medicine, in religious ceremonies, and even as currency. A worker's wages might be paid in peppercorns. Nobles displayed their spice collections like art. But there was a problem for Europeans. They couldn't get spices directly. Every gram had to pass through Arab middlemen who controlled all trade routes between East and West. By the 7th century, Arab conquests had created a vast caliphate stretching from Spain to Central Asia. The Arabs held every port, every trade route, every customs house. Not a single peppercorn entered Europe without Arab inspection and taxation. This made Arabs spectacularly wealthy. While Europe struggled through the Dark Ages, the Arab world experienced a golden age of wealth, learning, and power, all built on the spice trade. The markup was obscene. Spices passed through 12 pairs of hands between the Maluku Islands and European tables. Each middleman took their cut. The journey took 2 years, and Arabs weren't about to reveal their sources. They told elaborate lies to protect their monopoly. Cinnamon, they claimed, came from giant birds who built nests from cinnamon sticks on impossibly high cliffs. Black pepper grew in forests guarded by venomous serpents. Europeans had no way to verify these tales, so they believed them, and they paid whatever Arabs demanded. By the Middle Ages, European nobility was desperate. Spices were essential for preserving meat, masking flavors of spoiling food, and displaying wealth and status. In medieval London, a pound of saffron cost more than 1.5 cows. You could feed multiple families for weeks on what people paid for half a kilogram of spice. But Europeans had no choice. The overland routes were controlled by hostile Muslim powers. The Mediterranean was dominated by Venice, which had grown rich as the European distributor of Arab imported spices. There seemed to be no way around the monopoly, unless you could sail around it. This crazy idea drove European exploration. Portugal led the way. For decades, Portuguese sailors inched down the African coast, mapping unknown waters, facing fears of sea monsters and boiling equatorial oceans. In 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded Africa's southern tip, proving a sea route to the Indian Ocean existed. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey, reaching India in 1498. His expedition was brutal. He left with 170 men. Only 55 returned. But those survivors brought back spices worth 60 times what the expedition cost. Portugal had broken the Arab monopoly. Meanwhile, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus convinced Spain to fund a different approach: sail west to reach the east. He was catastrophically wrong about Earth's size, but Queen Isabella gambled on him anyway. In 1492, Columbus set sail to find spices. Instead, he found the Caribbean. He never admitted his failure. Columbus died believing he'd reached the outskirts of Asia. He called the native people Indians, and the hot peppers they cultivated, pepper, because he was convinced he'd found the spice roots. He hadn't, but he'd accidentally discovered continents that would change everything. The most harrowing journey came later. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan departed with 5 ships and 237 men, determined to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west around South America. The voyage was hell. Navigating through what's now called the Strait of Magellan took 38 days of treacherous waters. Then came the Pacific crossing. For 99 days, they saw no land. Food vanished. Water went rancid. Sailors ate rats, sawdust, and strips of leather from the ship's rigging, soaking it in seawater and roasting it over coals. Scurvy killed 19 men before they reached Guam. Magellan himself died in the Philippines. Only one ship, the Victoria, completed the circumnavigation. 18 men survived from the original 237. But that single ship carried 26 tons of spices worth 300% profit. Think about that. Over 90% of the crew died. 4 out of 5 ships were lost. And it was still considered a spectacular financial success. That's how valuable spices were. For the next 2 centuries, European powers fought brutal wars over spice-producing regions. The Dutch East India Company became the most powerful, controlling most of Southeast Asia's spice trade through military force. They were absolutely ruthless. On the Banda Islands, when locals resisted, the Dutch slaughtered nearly the entire population. Out of 15,000 people, only about 1,000 survived. The Dutch also manipulated supply to maintain high prices, once burning 4,000 tons of spices rather than let the market become saturated. But the age of spices couldn't last forever. In 1797, an American captain named Jonathan Carnes landed in New York with Indonesian pepper worth $100,000. He'd sailed directly to the source and bought cheap. American merchants quickly scaled up operations. By the mid-19th century, they'd monopolized spice transportation. Development of faster ships, better preservation methods, and true global trade networks crashed prices permanently. Spices that once cost fortunes became as ordinary as salt. Today, you can buy black pepper for pocket change at any supermarket. India produces 3 million tons of spices annually. Bangladesh, China, and Turkey follow. Together, these countries produce 93% of the world's spices. The aromatics that launched 1,000 ships and toppled empires are now background flavors in your Tuesday night dinner. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Those Indonesian traders who first crossed the South China Sea 3,500 years ago couldn't have imagined their cinnamon would eventually be worthless. Columbus died thinking he'd succeeded. Magellan's crew suffered beyond comprehension for cargo that today wouldn't cover their medical bills. History is made by people chasing treasures they don't fully understand. So, what's our generation's spice? What are we pursuing with such intensity that future generations will take for granted? Rare earth elements for smartphones, lithium for batteries, data, clean water. Whatever it is, the pattern will repeat. We'll risk everything for it. We'll build fortunes and destroy lives over it. And eventually, our descendants will barely notice it while chasing their own precious treasures. That's not a tragedy. That's the engine of human progress. We're a species that never stops exploring, never stops pushing boundaries, never stops believing the next horizon holds something worth the journey. The spice trade connected our world for the first time, sparked the age of exploration, and proved that humans will cross any ocean and overcome any obstacle in pursuit of what they value. The next time you reach for cinnamon or pepper, remember, you're touching something that once reshaped the world. That's the power of spices, and that's the story of how pepper and cinnamon changed everything.